is going flawlessly. Welcome to the Run Out. I am your host, Neil Barrett. This has been a complete disaster of an episode. I recorded this over, I think it took me about 4 hours to get recorded, and then I was editing it, for about a day and a half. I don't know why. I just could not do it quickly in any reasonable form or fashion. And I don't know. I was so slow. It took me so long to edit it. I was trying to get the questions to have like a video presentation and stuff. Everything was looking good, and it just took me a really long time. And then I went to export it and had so many issues. The MP3 that I upload to Spotify and Apple Music and all those places seemed to go flawlessly. I even double checked the audio was great. I, skipped through, made sure that everything was the way that it was supposed to be. Looked great. But when it came time to export the video, I had so many issues. It crashed Adobe Premiere Pro several times. It crashed Adobe's media encoder several times. I even tried it on another computer. It said the file was corrupted on the other computer. I couldn't even get it to load, even though it was loading just fine on my regular computer. And then when I brought it back to my other computer, I was just going to upload a quick video snippet at the beginning saying that, I had some technical issues, and went to upload the MP3 that, again, I had already checked and everything was good to go on. Suddenly it had only done my music track, which, was my intro music and then my outro music, and nothing else was there. And again, the file, I couldn't even reload the file to try and, redo the MP3. It was just such a disaster. So all that to say, I am now recording this live for, again, I believe the third time that I have done this. It will be up as kind of a live podcast. It will be a little bit sloppier, I guess, than my normal podcasts would be. So if you're used to that, just know that it's going to be a little bit different this week, and hopefully next week we are back to normal. But with that being said, before we get into the mailbag for the week, let's talk about PLL free agency, which started Monday at noon. At the time I wrote this, we were only about 24 hours into free agency. There has been a few things since then. I'm not really going to touch them. I'm going to kind of leave what I had for this episode, and then, next week or something, we can get into some of the other news that has been announced since I originally recorded this episode. But we will start with the Denver Outlaws, who have previously announced that they re-signed Logan Wisnauskas. In addition to that, they re-signed Justin Anderson, Mike Manley, Jesse Bernhardt, Nick Grill, Greg Weil, and Owen McElroy. Dan Arestia has reported that they are also going to be signing Zach Geddes from Carolina in free agency, though that hasn't been officially announced even as of right now. So although, Dan is very good at his job and I trust him implicitly, if he is reporting that something is happening, it is almost definitely happening. But because it has not been officially announced, technically anything could happen. As for the previously mentioned players that were re-signed, they lock up all of their best players who were free agents and kept that defense intact, which I think is huge for the Outlaws championship hopes. If they stay healthy, I think this is the best defensive six in the league. There are a few teams that can, make that claim, but I think that they are far and away, not far and away, I shouldn't say far and away. I think they are above them. Again, there's a few that are close, but I think they are, in fact, the best. And if they do actually end up adding Zach Geddes to that lineup, you are looking at one of the best short stick defensive midfield pairings in the league with Zach Geddes and Ryan Tarafinko. Obviously, having Jake Pacino as the LSM, that is a really, really good midfield unit. And I think they have the best 1-2-3 combo in the back with JT Giles Harris, Jesse Bernhardt, and Mike Manley. They also have really, really solid depth on the back end with Greg Weil and Nick Grill. Very, very capable replacements if and when they are needed. Moving on to the New York Atlas, they signed Cole Williams from the Utah Archers and Kyle Jackson from the Carolina Chaos. Not a ton to say here other than this is probably just the deepest offense in the league by a fairly solid margin. In fact, I think there's a solid case for them actually being too deep, which of course is not really a thing, but is just kind of my way of saying that there are going to be some very big names that don't dress on an almost weekly basis for the Atlas. But all that being said, Cole Williams and Kyle Jackson were two of the best offensive free agents available this offseason, and signing both of them is an absolute coup for Coach Pressler and this Atlas offense. I expect them to once again be just an almost unstoppable offense. Speaking of Kyle Jackson, his old team, the Carolina Chaos, have re-signed Sergio Perkovic and Austin Kaut, and new Chaos GM Spencer Ford traded the third-round pick about a week ago in next year's draft for Chris Aslanian and Carter Parlett. I don't think that anyone really thought Austin Kaut was going anywhere. Most of the goalies in this league are pretty entrenched in their starting roles, and short of being a starter elsewhere, I don't think Kaut was likely to find a better position than what he has in Carolina. The Perk signing doesn't do a ton for me. He is a 30-year-old kind of spot-up shooter who struggles to create his own shot. He hasn't shot 30% in 3 years and has only scored double-digit points once in those 3 years, and that was last year when he only scored 11 points. So he doesn't seem likely to solve many of the issues facing this Carolina Chaos offense. Hopefully, for the Chaos' sake, I'm wrong, and he plays a part in this offense turning things around. But I just don't see that happening. I'm not holding my breath for that. So again, the Perk signing doesn't do a ton for me. Chris Aslanian, though, I think, while not necessarily a huge name, I think he instantly becomes the most PLL established midfielder on this roster and could be very, very good for them as a third or fourth option on that offense. Carter Parlett was one of the kind of breakout stars of the championship series, perhaps even the breakout star of the championship series. And when Zach Geddes leaves, that will open up a spot for Carter Parlett to just slide right in to the starting six of what was the best defensive unit in the league last year. So not anything to sniff at all. I think it's a pretty good pickup on both ends. If I was going to be slightly nitpicky about it, Carter Parlett did not reach the 30% threshold for the Cannons last year, which meant that he was available to be signed as a free agent without having to trade for him or anything. And so, I don't know the ins and outs of these trades. I don't know what the conversations were. And I would hope that Spencer Ford, I know he's a good enough GM that I would hope he didn't miss the opportunity to, potentially sign Carter Parlett for less than a third round pick. They could have signed him for free, essentially, and then, gotten Chris Aslanian if they really wanted him for, maybe a fourth or a fifth even. So, without having been part of those conversations, I don't know how that works, but, it makes me wonder if that could have been done. But ultimately, I think that's kind of nitpicky, because I think if it took a third round pick to guarantee that you got both guys, then that is what it is. And you can't really say too much, because I do think that both players are going to be pretty good pickups for the Carolina Chaos. Later in the day, Monday evening, the Redwoods made some moves, signing Ryan Ogevin and Jackson Morrill from the Archers and Marquez White from the player pool. Most of the noise around the Redwoods has been around what is going to happen with RP3. That's still up in the air. It's still up in the air now, just as it was several days ago when I was writing this. And that includes the Redwoods. Most of the league is vying for his signature. So, we'll see what happens there. But I really like the Augie and Jackson Morrill signings, because I think both are good pieces for an RP3 team. Like, if he re-signs with them, they can both play off ball. They can both finish plays. But if RP3 leaves, you're still in a good place, because both are capable of creating their own opportunities. And Jackson Morrill, especially, can himself be a quarterback of the offense, especially if you need him back at X. As for Marquez White, I'd be lying if I said I knew much about him, but I know that a lot of people who know his game much better than me are very excited about what he can do with this Redwoods defense. They have been singing his praises since this move was announced. So that's one to kind of keep your eye on. Hopefully it works out. I always want guys to do well. Like, I'm not trying to hate on anyone. So hopefully he does well. I know he has played some box in the NLL, and so a lot of NLL guys were pretty excited about his joining the Redwoods. But again, I just don't know him super well in his game. So it's hard for me to really predict or suggest what will or won't work out for them. So that was kind of the news from the first 24-ish hours of the free agency deadline. What's up, Chris? Nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. You joined at the perfect time. We were talking about your Redwoods, but let's move on to the mailbag questions. Sunday and Monday, I asked you guys to write in questions. Could be about anything, didn't really matter. But I got a handful, and we will get into them. The first question came from someone who preferred not to be announced. That was going to be a little bit different when I was recording this and had a whole, graphic set up for this, but they asked, what is your favorite tape and why, and does it change per position? I'm assuming this question is referring to stuff like sorry, hold on. There we go. I am assuming that you mean stick tape, and Howie's hockey tape has been my go-to for stick tape for probably a decade or more now. I love the texture and the grip it provides without kind of like tearing up the palms of my gloves. I'm just very, very used to the way that it feels, and I have it on all of my sticks. I'm actually seeing my sticks in the back corner back here, and it's not actually on all of my sticks. As you can see, right here is a Throne Rift that I have never actually used in a game. It obviously does not have tape. This Powell one I got when I was working for Powell, and it has also not been used in a game, so it's not taped. But like this True handle right here, and this STX handle right here, and then several others back there that you can't really see. Those are like gamers that I have used and played with for a while, and they of course have tape on them. I think I do have one that has a lizard skin on it, It's not my preferred style, but you know, if you're a little bit of a newer age, like I said, I started playing back in the early 2000s, and tape was like the only thing that anyone ever used. So I'm just so used to the feeling of it now that like it's my preferred thing. If you are younger or you don't like the feeling of tape or something, lizard skins are fine. Again, it's not my preference, but I can't say anything negative about it. It's got a little bit of a softer feel to it, kind of almost like a spongy feel when you grip it. So I can't say anything negative about it if you want, but that's kind of the extent of my experience with things other than actual tape. So again, I'm going to go with Howie's hockey tape, but you know, lizard skins aren't bad. I think Vuk Grips is the PLL partner. Don't know much about them, but certainly check them out if that's your kind of thing. But I'm sticking with Howie's hockey tape. The next question came from Casey Dole. I hope I'm saying that right. It almost sounds like an insult. I don't know what the person's name is. That's their screen name. But I always feel like I'm calling Casey Dole. Anyway, his question was, any advice for aspiring graphic designers? And I am certainly not an expert in instructing graphic design, but the best advice I can give you is to just do it. Do it over and over and over and over again. The only way to learn and get better is to do it. If you are completely brand new, you have no idea what to do when it comes to graphic design, the best advice I can give you, the place that I started, was YouTube. You can find pretty much anything that you want on YouTube. Anything that you're looking for, it is on YouTube. Like I said, that's where I started. There are so many like step-by-step tutorials, even in kind of a sports landscape. I think the first one I did was a Tom Brady design, and I just swapped out the image of Tom Brady for Lyle Thompson, and otherwise just did exactly what they told me to, step by step. There are plenty of like masterclass places like Skillshare and Udemy and Coursera, et cetera, as well as plenty of creators who have their own courses that you can do, but and they're great. And I'm not saying don't do those. I have done several of them. They are great and good sources of information. But one of the things that I like about YouTube is that you can go and look for a specific thing that you're trying to learn. You don't have to sit through, a 10-hour course of all of Photoshop. You can say, I want to learn this one specific thing. The next step, if you're a little bit more comfortable with it, the next thing I'd say is find some artists that you like, whether it's me or Chris Ramirez right there, or, Jackson Holman or Michael Harrison or Liam at the PLL, or someone outside of lacrosse even. There are plenty of great artists out there. And the thing that I would say is look at their work and find something that you like. Take one of their designs and literally copy it. Obviously, don't post it and pass it off as your own work, but you can learn so much by literally being like, okay, they laid out their cutouts like this, they put the text like this, and just like figuring it out how they like technically created the piece. And then once you kind of have some basic understanding of how they're creating what you like, you can then start to remix it, for lack of a better term, and create your own kind of designs, by remixing their stuff and just learning stuff. And then probably the last little thing that I'd say is don't just look at like sports design. You can look at t-shirt design, look at poster designs, look at people that do photo bashing and like digital art kind of stuff. You can learn so much about things outside that can kind of inform the way that you do it. I have I've recorded it twice, and I might have to record it again. Maybe I just have like issues with recording. I don't know what's going on, but like I said, I've twice now recorded, and I'm hoping to get it out later, even if I have to re-record it over the next week or so. I have a kind of a walkthrough, not necessarily a step-by-step tutorial, but a walkthrough of how I created a specific piece. And one of the big things that I do is I use a technique called the reverse curves, which I'm not going to go into here. Again, it will be in that kind of step-by-step kind of guide that I'm trying to do later this month. But all that to say, I got the reverse curves technique that I use to create shadows and highlights from Pix Imperfect, who is just basically just kind of a general like photo editing kind of person. And so you never know where you are going to, find inspiration and information that can make you better and make your artwork better. So, yeah, that's, again, I'm not an expert, but yeah, that's kind of my advice for anyone who is trying to get into the world of graphic design. The next question comes from J. Rodriguez 621, who asks, who is your Final Four prediction and who wins the championship this year? Excuse me. Honestly, this is the first season in a good while where it has truly felt like it was completely unpredictable. Like the last decade, basically, it's felt like you had a pretty good idea of who was going to be left standing on Memorial Day weekend. And this is one of the first times in a really long time that I can remember that it has felt completely unpredictable. And I don't think there is anyone in the top 20 currently that would be totally shocking to see. We just saw Richmond give Cornell everything it could handle this past weekend. And while, yeah, would it be a surprise if they were a final team? Probably. It would almost definitely involve an upset of some kind, relatively minor, I would think. But I don't think that if you saw them in the Final Four Memorial Day weekend, you would be like, oh my God, where did this come from? Because we have seen what they're capable of. And this made me laugh. The other day I saw Dan Arestia describe it as, it's not that everyone is good, it's that everyone is medium. And, besides that making me laugh really hard, it also just feels true this year. The double graduation of last year has reset so many of these teams back to maybe not zero, but has kind of reset these teams. And it feels like no one is really good. Everyone's just kind of like at that medium point. And so even a team like Maryland, as good as they've been, as good as their resume says they are, if Maryland doesn't show up in the Final Four, I don't think you'll be like, oh, holy crap. They're what, 3 goals from being like 2-3, so it easily could go the other way for them. Not that I think it necessarily will, but it could be, and it wouldn't be this crazy shock. That all being said, I am not going to cop out of the question. I'm going to give you an answer, but I would like to say this is where I'm at today, right here, right now, the 6th of March. And I think you would be a fool not to have Maryland right now. I know I just said that Maryland could be out, and they could, but they're 5-0 with wins against the 2nd, 4th, 11th, and 13th ranked teams. So they're 5-0, and 4 of their wins are against top 15 teams. So I don't know how you could not say right here, right now, that they are going to be in the Final Four. I do kind of have this feeling like they won't get it done in May. That could honestly be some bias. I am a bona fide Maryland hater. But, you know, even I try, even with that, I try to be as objective as possible. And I don't know. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop with this Maryland team. Like I said, they're only a handful of goals from being like 2-3. So, you know, I keep waiting for them to lose, and I think it's possible that they don't. But again, based on where they are, you know, until I see some bigger cracks in that facade, I think you'd be a fool not to have them in a Final Four prediction. My second team, and this is probably not a shock to anyone, is Princeton. I don't think I really have to explain that, but beating Duke and UNC away in the same weekend might be the single best weekend we've seen so far, and an excellent way to prepare for the Final Four weekend. I think they have everything needed to make the Final Four, and I don't know, you're going to have to do something special to stop them so far. Again, ask me in a couple weeks and that might change, but we'll see. My third team, and this pains me terribly to say, is UNC. I know they have some issues, but in my mind, they seem like a team that is like the Duke 2021 team, where the first team that can actually pull off the game plan to beat them, they won't really meet until the Final Four. They will, in the round one, they'll play an AQ from a smaller conference. They will probably win somewhat handedly. In week 2, they'll probably play a kind of low-end top 20 team that, again, I'm not saying they're going to win big, but they should win relatively easily just based on talent. And so it'll really be that Final Four where they play a top 5 or 7 team, where it'll be the first kind of opportunity for a team to beat them based on like having the ability to slow down Dom and Owen Duffy. And, you know, it could be that in the semifinal game, they get beat a lot like that Duke 2021 team did when they played Maryland, and they lost, 14-5, because again, it was just the first team that they went up against in the tournament that was capable of slowing them down. And so I don't really think that UNC has a really strong national championship vibe. I think they have a pretty clear game plan for how to beat them in terms of, trying to slow down Dom and Owen Duffy and make the whole rest of the team beat you, which can be done. They just haven't shown that they can do it consistently. So yeah, I think they could make it to the Final Four and Memorial Day weekend without really being tested and without really having a strong chance at the national championship. For my final team, I think there's obviously a couple of options. Cornell is probably going to be the easy pick that most people are going to pick, but I'm just not convinced by them lately. We just talked about Richmond gave them everything they could handle. They have the talent, like, without a doubt, but they, apart from, CJ Kirst, who is as advertised, they just haven't played like a Final Four team in my mind. So I'm not going to pick them. They do in the next 2 weeks play Penn State and Princeton. So, we'll see if in 2 weeks they win those 2 games, and they win them. They could win them real easily, and in 2 weeks we I am saying something completely different, but so far I just haven't been real impressed by them and what they have done on the field. I think Army is going to be a real trendy pick, but while I certainly think they are a good team, I think they are slightly inflated by playing a quote-unquote weaker schedule. I think they're more realistically around that kind of 10 spot. And again, I won't be surprised to see them on Memorial Day weekend, but I just don't think they make it. I don't think they have the talent to run with teams when you get into May. Excuse me. So with all of that being said, I think my personal pick for the fourth team in the Final Four is Penn State. I have been so impressed with them. I think they can score in bunches and they have it all. They play defense. They have a good goalie play. They can run, and they have already shown that they can play with anyone when they took Princeton to overtime a couple of weeks ago. The one caveat I have with this pick is the health of Matt Traynor. He's easily their best player, and he missed large portions of the game this past weekend at Yale. It was really weird because he wasn't playing, just like, there'd be 8-10 minute stretches where he didn't come on the field at all. And then they would go man up and he would come out on the field, but it was almost like he was being used as a decoy. He was playing up top and was just simply exchanging the ball. And several times I even saw the penalty expired and Penn State maintained possession. They still had the ball. They still had time on the clock, and they subbed him while they maintained possession. So he was really being used as a man-up decoy. That being said, there's been no announcement that I'm aware of about his health, or even if there is some kind of injury, about when he may or may not be back. So definitely something to keep an eye on and see how that shakes out for them. Because if he's on the field, I think they have very, very good chance of making the Final Four. He is that good. I will say, even without him, I mean, they handled Yale very, very easily. And that doesn't mean a whole lot because Yale is having a down year, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that even without him, they could be a Final Four team. They have been very good, but I think, with him, I'm going to put him in. So just to recap, that is Maryland, UNC, Princeton, and Penn State. Those are my four. As for who is holding the championship trophy come Memorial Day Monday, I am going to have to go with, obviously, Duke. Duh. I don't even know why you asked that. What's up, Brian? Let's lacrosse. Yeah, let's lacrosse. The next question came from CT95 Designs, who asks, who do you think will be the next club team to make the Division I jump? This is a very good question. It gets asked all the time, but it's still a very good question. But it is one that is nearly impossible to accurately predict. Title IX is what Title IX is, and it is so hard to get an athletic department into a position where adding men's lacrosse is even possible. With that in mind, though, I am sure there is some school out there that I'm totally blanking on, but off the top of my head, Texas is my favorite to make the jump. They remind me a lot of Michigan and where Michigan was around 2005, where they were going kind of all in on their club lacrosse team and building a just crazy good team. And Brian, Syracuse, clearly. Yeah, no, I'm going Duke, bud. Yeah, so I think Texas is where Michigan was, where they're going kind of all in on their club lacrosse team. They have hired Kyle Hartzell and are building out something in an area where lacrosse is exploding in Texas, where, you know, they have all kinds of talent to pull from. And if they can get Texas to where Michigan got to, with Michigan ultimately won 3 championships in a row. I think it was 2007, 2008, and 2009 were there 3 in a row. So if Texas can get to there, and I'm not even saying specifically 3 in a row, if they can win 1, 2 and 3 years, you know, if they can get to that point where they are consistently, you know, making championship games and pushing for championships, they have the other thing that Michigan had that I think could really kind of make this a real possibility. And that is a huge alumni network and boosters that have a lot of money. And I think that's so important because, again, Title IX being Title IX, you can't just add men's lacrosse because you want to. You have to add the same number of opportunities for women. And that doesn't necessarily mean a women's lacrosse team, though that would be great. A women's lacrosse team often doesn't have the same number of players as a men's lacrosse team, so you can't even just add 1 for 1. It often requires adding multiple women's teams to get a men's lacrosse team. So you need to get these big money boosters and alumni that you have to invest and make it worthwhile the athletic department to add, again, not just a men's lacrosse team, but also a women's lacrosse team and or several other women's teams in order for it to all balance out. But because of everything I just laid out, where Texas is and the growth of the game in that state and the potential big money backers, if they can get to a point, I think they are the most likely to make the jump next. There are several other places that could potentially do it, but again, I think they are lacking several of the things. You know, Florida State has been a fairly good MCLA team for many years, and they're not really knocking on that D1 door. South Carolina, some of these SEC schools, similar boat. They can be good, they can win national championships, and it just doesn't feel like it has quite the same ability to happen as it does in Texas. So I'm going Texas. You guys can let me know if there are other places that you think could happen. I'm probably forgetting someone, but that is my pick. The next question comes from Dog Griff, who asks, what are your thoughts on the Andy Towers situation? I talked about this a couple of episodes ago, but it's been a little bit of time, and we maybe have a little bit more information since the last time I talked about it. But I just think it's really hard to have strong thoughts on this because we just don't know the entire picture of what took place. I think it's important to remember before we get into this that this is a single entity league, meaning the league itself owns all of the teams. And I think that's part of the issue with this scenario, is that there is a lot of confusion about when the PLL was acting as the league and when it was acting as the owner of the Carolina Chaos. Based on what we do know, it seems like some players and or the PLL had issues with an assistant coach for the Chaos and wanted to make a change. Given the difficulty that the Carolina Chaos had on the offensive end, it has been rumored, that the coach in question was Matt Panetta, who was serving as the offensive coordinator, but that has never been confirmed or denied for that matter. Which players had a problem? We don't know. How many players had a problem? We don't know. Did the PLL want to make a change and asked the players what they thought, or did the players come to the PLL and ask for a change to be made? We don't really know. And again, as I said earlier, at what point the PLL was representing the league and its interests versus at what point was it representing the Carolina Chaos and its interests, again, we don't know. But most people's kind of feelings on the situation seem to be based on what they believe the answers to those questions are. What we do know is that, however, we started down this road, it got to a point where the PLL asked Andy Towers to get rid of this assistant coach, again, presumed to be Matt Panetta. Andy Towers, it was reported, felt that he was being blindsided by this. He didn't think that it was basically the first that he was kind of hearing about the issues with this assistant coach, and felt that he wanted to be able to take this upcoming season to address it and make changes and try and, walk the line and try and make things better. And then at which point, if it failed, he would be willing to move on from that assistant coach after the season. The answer from the PLL on that kind of idea appears to have been no. The league wanted the move to happen now, and Andy Towers decided that rather than firing his coach without an opportunity to address the situation, he was going to stand by him, and said that if that assistant coach was being asked to leave, that he was going to leave, and the rest of his staff said that they were on board with Andy Towers, and that if Andy Towers was leaving, then they were going to leave as well. And the league said, thank you for your service, but it will not be needed anymore. So with that context, I think the way both handled kind of that second half is fair. I think both sides have understandable points of view. I would probably have liked to see the league give Andy Towers some leeway and allow him to try and figure it out with his guys in his locker room and try and make it work. As a coach myself, I know that if I felt like this was the first time I was hearing something, that I would want to be allowed the opportunity to try and, correct the course of the ship. But I can also, at least to some degree, understand the league saying, no, we want to make a change, and guys in the locker room are unhappy and we want to make the change now. I don't think that's completely unreasonable, especially if you are acting as the owner of a team. Again, we're back to when we're acting as the league and when we're acting as the owner of the league. As for the first half of the equation and how we got to the point where we had to sit down with Andy Towers and talk about this, I think there's just so much that we don't know and probably never will know. And it's nearly impossible to really tell who overstepped, who initiated this, who was the antagonist, etc. So I just kind of tend to ignore that first half because so much of what you hear about it is based on rumor and innuendo and people's biases, and I absolutely refuse to deal with the Paul is a puppet master kind of BS theories out there. I'm so over that narrative and the idea that Paul is, pulling strings because he watches the WWE, which is just so stupid. So ultimately, I think it's just all around an unfortunate scenario that I think it probably could have and should have been resolved without anyone losing their job, but it wasn't. And ultimately, I think both parties ultimately bear at least some responsibility and culpability in how we ended up where we ended up. That being said, one of the best parts of the offseason for me came as a result of this whole situation, and that is with the Chaos not only hiring a replacement head coach in Roy Colsey, but in a league first, hiring a GM in Spencer Ford. Both are great fits for these roles, and I'm excited to see the way the rest of the league transitions to this style and the way it can change the way that these franchises operate in the future. I'm really interested to see what it looks like with these teams making the transition, and whether, teams start adding GMs, or if we're waiting until some of these current head coaches leave, and then, like with the Chaos, they'll bring in a coach and a GM. That for me is going to be one of the more interesting things over the next couple of seasons, because they definitely want to get GMs on some of these teams. So the next question comes from a good friend of mine, actually, named Will McGarty. He asks, what will it take for lacrosse to become mainstream? This is Will speaking. I feel like hockey and golf have exploded in the past decade, and I still see lacrosse as a fringe sport. Considering the barrier of entry is somewhat similar between all three of these sports in terms of equipment costs and locations and stuff like that, what needs to change to make people care? First of all, I have to say to Will, thank you for asking this question. Will is not a lacrosse guy. He hired me. We had known each other for a little while, and then he hired me at High Point to broadcast the lacrosse games and other sports. And then we have worked on several things since then. He is a very good friend of mine, but he is outside of the lacrosse world. So whenever he supports me in graphic design or YouTube or podcasting or whatever, which he has always done without question, I am always just very, very thankful for that. Secondly, though, again, knowing Will the way that I know him a bit better than pretty much everyone else who submitted a question. I think I can say with some certainty, and Will, if you're listening, feel free to message me and tell me otherwise, but I feel fairly certain that I can say that these sports have not exploded so much as you personally are paying more attention to them. I know for a fact that you have picked up golf in the last decade and play it much more regularly than you did, 10 years ago or whatever. But my evidence of that is that the four majors, for anyone who doesn't know, that's the Masters, the US Open, the British Open, and the PGA Championship, have all seen a pretty steady decline in viewership over the last 30 years. That's due to a number of reasons. This is neither the place nor am I the person to speak on those things for golf specifically. But I think it's pretty safe to say that it's not exploding in the way that you might think, being that you have picked it up more recently and are paying more attention. And again, I know you fairly well. I also know that you are not really a hockey guy. If you'll remember, and I know you won't have any issue with me telling this story because it's not meant as an insult to you. It's not something I'm mad about or anything. It's just a funny little anecdote. But if you'll remember, we were working on a TV show several years ago with our good mutual friend, Aaron, who I played lacrosse with in college. And we wrapped our show, and then I think it was the next week was Veterans Day, and you and Aaron very graciously offered to take me out to dinner and then out to a hockey game to celebrate Veterans Day. The Blackhawks were playing the Hurricanes in Raleigh. Those are my two favorite teams, and they were playing on Veterans Day. So it just kind of worked out, and you guys thought it would be a good opportunity, and I was honored that you guys wanted to do something for me. So that was the plan. And again, I know you'll remember, we went and had dinner, and I believe we had dinner in Raleigh, if I remember correctly. And then right before we were going to leave, you decided that you were going home because you weren't a hockey fan and you didn't care to watch the game. And Aaron and I went to the game by ourselves and took a picture of an empty seat between us, pointing to the invisible U. So again, all that to say that, I know that you are not really a big hockey guy. And so I have to assume that you included hockey here, both because, yes, it is somewhat similar to lacrosse in terms of the barrier to entry, which I'll get to in a minute, but also because of the success of the recent Four Nations face-off tournament that happened and its kind of explosion of people watching it. But I feel like it's important to point out that hockey ratings outside of that tournament have been awful this season. Opening night viewership was down 39% from even last year, just that 1 year alone. The Winter Classic had its worst ever viewership. That is, for anyone who doesn't know, the NHL's annual outdoor hockey game played between generally two of the kind of original six teams in, a football stadium or a baseball stadium or something. It's a really cool event, actually. But it had its lowest ever viewership. There were some legitimate reasons. If I remember correctly, they moved it. Instead of playing it New Year's Day, they played it New Year's Eve. These were not two of the biggest teams, but again, all that to say, it was the lowest viewership that they had ever had. And literally the week before the Four Nations face-off started, NHL games around the league were peaking at about 200,000 viewers. To put that into some context in the relationship to lacrosse, the opening PLL game last year peaked at 600,000 viewers and averaged nearly 425,000 viewers. So the average for that opening PLL game was about twice what any NHL game was getting the week before the Four Nations face-off. I really think that we are overstating, and I've kind of ranted about this on social media, but I really think that we're overstating the Four Nations face-off. I think while, yes, it was good and it was fun, I think that there are some very legitimate reasons why that took off that are not repeatable. For instance, obviously there are insane tensions between the US and Canada right now that played into a large part of it. When Marjorie Taylor Greene is tweeting about hockey, it ain't about hockey. The other thing I think a lot of people miss out on that they don't fully understand, especially if they're not watching hockey with any kind of regularity, is that these players that were involved, almost all of them, had not played for their national teams in 6, 7, 8 years. The NHL was not involved in the Olympics. The IIHF World Championships are usually played by younger players. So a lot of these big name established players like Sidney Crosby and Connor McDavid and the big names hadn't played since 2016 and 2017 for their country. So there is an element of being able to put on your country's jersey for the first time in a really long time that I think added to that tournament and the play that you saw on the ice in a way that won't if you do it next year and the year after that and the year after that. It will become much more commonplace and guys will sort of stop playing quite as hard as they did in this specific edition. So all that to say, I don't think other sports are doing quite as well as it might sometimes feel, again, especially if you are inside of the sport. Sports viewership as a whole is way down. The only sport that isn't actively losing viewers is the NFL, and they are largely kind of plateaued and holding steady on viewers, which I would feel as the NFL as a loss. They were growing so consistently and steadily for so long that even sitting still feels like you're moving backwards. So to your larger point, though, what will it take for lacrosse to become mainstream? I think there are three things, and then I'll kind of add a little bonus thing at the end. More people need to play the game, I think, is number one. By the most recent estimates, there are around 2 million lacrosse players in the U.S. The current U.S. population is 350 million people. So if you do the math real quick on that, that means about half a percentage point of the US population plays lacrosse. So while the game is growing and it can feel massive, again, especially if you are actively involved in the game and in the community surrounding the game, you can see that it has a long way to go, and it definitely helps you to understand why the most common thing that you'll hear after telling someone that you play lacrosse is the one with the butterfly nets. For context, the same sources that gave us the 2 million lacrosse players number estimate that there are nearly 6 million football players, which is a sport that almost nobody plays after college. There are 14 million soccer players, and there are 30 million basketball players. So again, lacrosse has a long way from being anywhere near the mainstream sports in terms of population just playing the game. And that's not something that will change overnight. It will take consistent and steady growth over probably the next several decades to be anywhere near something that grabs a foothold in the kind of sporting consciousness of this country. Lacrosse now reminds me of soccer when the NASL was around. The NASL, for anyone who doesn't know, was a professional soccer league that was founded in 1968 and was capable of paying people a good amount of money and attracted some of the biggest names in the world of soccer. Pele came and played, for instance, Beckenbauer, lots of big, giant names in the world came to the U.S. to play, and it still was nearly 40 years, several failed leagues later before the MLS, who itself almost failed, and the sport of soccer became a legitimate and solvent sport in this country. And even it isn't at the level of most of the big four sports in the U.S. sporting ecosystem. So I think getting more people to play is probably point number one. Point number two, I think, is exposure. The PLL has done a great job in a very short amount of time. We have gone from regionally broadcast or non-broadcast MLL games with a championship game that aired on CBS Sports to the PLL having regular season and select regular season and championship game broadcast on ABC, ESPN, and ESPN2, with all of the games available through ESPN Plus, which again was not something that was available during the MLL era. Excuse me. It is being reported on during Sports Center. Players are appearing on Pat McAfee, Scott Van Pelt, Get Up, First Take, all the kind of big headline shows for ESPN. And PLL league announcements are being broken on major ESPN network shows. So, you can't really fault the PLL. We also have lacrosse joining the Olympics in 2028, and while that will come with its own issues, namely that it is a brand new version of the game created specifically for the Olympics and has not or was not played prior to its creation just several years ago, it will expose the sport of lacrosse to millions of people around the world. And hopefully that creates some demand to see more of the sport in its various other forms. The jury's still out on how much that will really help some of these other sports, but exposure is exposure, and it will hopefully, lift the whole saying of a rising tide lifts all boats. But that being said, we have, as much as, the PLL is doing great and the Olympics are going to be big, we have still a long way to go on those conversations of breaking into, again, the collective sporting consciousness of the average American sports fan. Barring an explosion in demand for the sport post the 2028 Olympics, which again could bring its own set of issues with people wanting to see the sixes game and not any of the other versions. That aside, I think barring, again, some kind of explosion in popularity, I think we are again looking at several decades of this level of exposure and kind of incremental increases before we get anywhere even remotely close to something as popular as one of the big four sports in this country. But I think another key aspect that comes with exposure is understanding. Despite all of the connections to other sports, especially hockey and basketball, both of which have large portions of their game kind of derived from hockey, people don't understand, or perhaps it's better put as don't think they understand what they're watching, and that makes them much more likely to turn the game off and not tune back in. But things like being on ESPN and being involved with the Olympics will show not just a US audience, but the world, the game in an easily digestible way that will help people, I think, find the connections between lacrosse that they don't know or feel they don't know and the other more popular sports that they do know. And I think that will be a really, really huge part of exposure. The last part that I think is going to be really important is investment. As with just about everything in our world, money drives all. Money will play a huge part in both exposure and getting more people to play the game. It will have a massive impact on the health of the league, pay for players, accessibility of the game, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, any aspect of the game that you can think of, money will make it better. So investment is going to be absolutely key. And that's not just rich men like Joe Tsai investing in the PLL or NLL, though that is certainly helpful in its own way. But investment of any kind, corporate sponsors will help, franchise owners will help, better TV rights deals will help. There's all kinds of things that will be massive for the growth of the game. This, what I'm saying, is mostly centered around the growth of the game at the professional level. And I know the concept of trickle down economics has largely been disproven in terms of the economy of a country, but I do think that there is actually a trickle down effect from professional sports down to the lower level of sports. So growth at the professional level of lacrosse will spur growth in college and high school and youth and so on. Getting a better TV deal will make the league more financially stable, which will allow the league to pay players more, which will ultimately make them full-time, which will increase the level of play, which will garner more exposure, which will get more players, which will create new players who need local leagues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think that you can over or underestimate the power of investment. Again, like I said, money drives all things. The kind of add-on point, those were kind of my 3 points. The kind of add-on point that I think kind of runs through all three of these is accessibility of the sport. Things like making the equipment cheaper. That's not something we have total control over, but in any ways that we can. I know Warrior came out with their $69.99 head deal thing a couple years ago, and that went away pretty quickly. So I don't know how feasible that is, but making equipment cheaper is a big deal, especially when you talk about global. One of the reasons that we don't talk about that we have seen the rise of Japan lacrosse is because they have an equipment manufacturer in Japan. I know if you live in Europe or Africa or Asia or something and you are looking for equipment, you have to buy American-made equipment and have it shipped across. And let's not even talk about the tariff situation in this country right now, which is going to make this even worse. I saw a tweet literally this morning about Canada having issues getting gear in, which is going to be a problem. But even beyond the tariff situation, getting equipment shipped back and forth across oceans and stuff significantly increases the price and makes the game even more difficult at a global scale to grow. So one of the big things that has helped Japan is Vassallo, I think is the name of, I don't know that I'm pronouncing that correctly, but they have an equipment manufacturer in Japan who makes equipment that is considerably cheaper and makes the game more accessible to Japanese players that is almost unmatched anywhere else in the world outside of the US and maybe Canada with some manufacturers, although the biggest lacrosse manufacturers are obviously American companies. So I think making the sport more accessible is going to be huge. And it's one of the reasons why I think sixes, for better or worse, is going to be the future of the game, just because of how much more accessible it's going to make it and how much better athletic directors, especially at youth leagues in middle school and high school and stuff, are going to see the financial viability of sixes over full field lacrosse. So just a thought. That being said, Will, if you are listening, I wish this was more of a conversation. I maybe can try and get you on and we could have more of a conversation about this, because I would love to hear your point of view as an outsider to the sport and as someone who, again, like I said earlier, you hired me at High Point. I know you have seen the game. You've been around the game some. You have asked me questions. For anyone who has followed me long enough, you would have had to follow me for several years now. But if anyone who has done that for a while, you might remember that there was a person who swore that he could play lacrosse like that he could pick it up super easily, and we made it a big thing. It was posted on my Instagram for a while. That was Will, and in his defense, he did pick it up a lot faster than me or Aaron, the buddy that I mentioned earlier that I played in college with. He did pick it up far faster than we thought he would be able to, but I do think that he also learned that it was probably more difficult than he thought, and I think ultimately both of us were wrong. But yeah, so that's Will. He is not really a lacrosse person, but I wonder what it is, having been around the game enough to experience it again, at least in bits and pieces. What about it that has never quite hooked you, and what I'd love to know what you think it needs to do as someone to kind of convert the average, American sports fan. Again, maybe one day we can actually have that conversation. That would be great. And, we haven't caught up in a while, so that would also be fun. But moving on, the next question comes from Ben Hilty. I hope I'm saying that right. Again, some of these names are so hard to know how you're pronouncing them when you only are seeing them. But Ben asked, who's a guest that you would love to have on the show at some point? This is a really tough question. I have a whole list written down on my Notion app of potential guests, that I would love to have on the show. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 of, kind of varying degrees of difficulty in terms of asking. And I don't know that I have one single person at the top of that list. I wrote the list in no real order, just as they came to me. I wrote them down. That being said, in my mind, a dream guest that I'd love to have on the show kind of implies, one, that they have some kind of personal connection or story or memory attached to them for me personally, and two, that they also have some level of difficulty in terms of getting them. As I don't think that I have to say Kyle Harrison is a dream guest of mine, but I have known Kyle Harrison for a while, and I know that generally speaking, just by asking him, he's likely to come on the show. So it's hard for me to put him in this list of dream guests, because I know I'm likely to get to him pretty easily. So for me, again, there has to be kind of a level of difficulty and unattainability to getting them as a guest for answering this question. So again, I don't know that I have one, but I'll give you three that are dream guests and have some level of difficulty towards getting them. Number one is Pat Spencer. Being a kid whose first love was basketball, who spent his whole childhood dreaming of playing in the NBA one day, I guess I should say. I grew up wanting to be Bobby Hurley. That's why I'm a Duke fan. I was a Duke basketball guy. I wanted to be Bobby Hurley. He played the game exactly like I did, and I wanted to be him. And then I wanted to go play for the Chicago Bulls like my favorite player, Michael Jordan, though I was never going to be Michael Jordan. And then, as I grew up, I am a fully formed adult male at about 5'7" and 160 pounds. So that dream was probably dead on arrival, because I did not have the athleticism of Muggsy Bogues or Spud Webb or, any of the smaller players of the time. But again, being a kid whose first love was basketball, I would love to talk to Pat Spencer, and it would probably largely be a conversation about basketball. There would probably be very little lacrosse conversation to be had. I would want to talk to him mostly about his journey into the NBA, which, as of yesterday, I believe it was, it was announced that his two-way contract that allows him to go back and forth between the G League and the NBA was being terminated, and he was being put on just a standard NBA contract. He is now just an NBA player, and that is pretty amazing. And he is living my, childhood dream. So Pat Spencer is number one. Number two would be Colin and Samir. They and TLN were huge inspirations to me, and were a big part of the reason why I even thought about getting into content creation of any kind. So I would love to get them on the show and talk to them about building TLN and, what they did and what they were going through in order to build TLN. And I would especially like to have that conversation now. I don't remember exactly when they left TLN, but it's been, 5, 6, 7, 8 10 years. I don't even remember. It's been a long enough period though now that I think they probably have more perspective on it. The last time I even remember hearing them talk about it was within the first year of them kind of getting out. I think they had been on Paul Rabel's podcast, and it was still within that first kind of year of them leaving TLN. So I'd love to hear what their thoughts are on the experience of building TLN with this kind of distance between it. And then of course, they both recently had kids. They're dads, and I would love to see their kind of perspective on the transition to that side of it. I just think that would be a fun conversation to have. So number 2 is Colin and Samir. Number 3 is, and I probably don't even have to say this, John Danowski. I think he is the best coach of all time. He's at least the best coach of my time playing the game. I never saw Roy Simmons coach or, Roy Simmons Jr. coach. A lot of the bigger names, were before my time. So he's at least the best coach of kind of my era. And I think he's a really unique character in the game. For anyone who doesn't know, he does coaching clinics every fall, I believe once a month, from September through November. Usually it's 3 or 4 a year. He does coaching clinics. You can watch them online. You can also go in person. If you go in person, he does about an hour online, and then he does about 2 hours in person. So you get a little bit of extra time with him. And I just think he's such a unique character in the game. He reminds me a lot of Phil Jackson, not specifically in ideals or mannerisms, although there is some of that. But in terms of being kind of a unique voice in the way that he sees the world and sees, playing lacrosse and coaching lacrosse and stuff like that. I love John Danowski, and I would love to have him on the show and talk to him about everything, life, lacrosse, kids, everything. So yeah, that would be my number 3. Again, there's others. I have, like I said, a list of like 50, but those are the 3 that would mean the most to me, and again have some level of difficulty. I would love to have Johnny Christmas on again. That means something to me, but I think I could do it. I just kind of need to reach out to him and see. But those would be my 3. The next question comes from Gable the Fable, who asks, with the recent re-signing of Logan Wisnauskas, acquiring Pat Kavanaugh in November, and having Brennan O'Neill, Denver has to focus solely on defense/goaltending in the draft, right? And then what is the realistic expectation for the Outlaws this season? Are they championship bound? Before I answer, Gable sent this in before I even asked for questions to be submitted. He sent this in on his own. But since Gable sent this question, Denver has announced that they have re-signed Mike Manley and Jesse Bernhardt, which brings back all of their starting 6 on defense. They also, again, like we talked about earlier, Dan Arestia is reporting that they are signing Zach Geddes. And I think it's also worth reporting or considering that they have no first round pick after the Pat Kavanaugh trade. So with that kind of added context on where the Outlaws stand, I have to say that even coming out of the season, before the Pat Kavanaugh trade, before any of the re-signings or anything, I thought the Outlaws' biggest need was an offensive midfielder, or probably 3. If I'm being completely honest. So the attack, even before the Pat Kavanaugh trade, I thought was in a really solid place. Could it have gotten better? Sure, but I thought they were in a pretty solid place with Brennan O'Neill and Eric Law and, Cross Ferrara or somebody else kind of filling that third role, Josh Shawada, Graham Bundy, whoever they wanted, kind of filling that third role. And then, of course, It was a little bit up in the air about Logan Wisnauskas, but pretty quickly after the end of the season, Topher Grace, the beat reporter for the Outlaws, was reporting that Tim Soudan was going to do everything he could to re-sign Logan Wisnauskas. And I always had this feeling like that was going to happen. I know a lot of people thought he was going to go to Maryland, but that was mostly because of the Maryland connection. I don't think he really fits in Maryland any more than he fits in Denver. So I always kind of thought that he was going to return there. And so again, the attack was really solid. The defense, I think, was one of the best in the league, especially if they're healthy. They weren't as good as they could have been last year because Jesse Bernhardt went down. And while they could arguably get better in goal, I think they like Owen McElroy a lot. And I don't see anyone in this draft class that is just a major improvement. There's no Liam Entenmann coming in. And when you combine that with the fact that they now have no first round draft pick, even the one guy I think that's projected to go in the first round is going to be gone. So I always kind of felt like their biggest need was a first rounder, or was an offensive midfielder. And if they had a first round pick, I was fully expecting them to go for Sam English or Andrew McAdory, someone that could slot into their midfield and be an initiator, who could be the kind of first dodge and was clean with the ball, could make a pass, could take a shot, obviously do all those things. I think we kind of expected that to be Sam Hanley in this offense, but he just hasn't really shown that yet. He had some flashes last year where he looked capable, but he just hasn't been consistent in that manner at the PLL level. So again, my plan, if they had not made the Pat Kavanaugh trade and they had a first rounder, I always thought they should be going for a Sam English or Andrew McAdory kind of player. Not having a first rounder obviously changes some things. Most of the players you think could be long-term answers for kind of any position will be gone. Adam Lamberti, in his most recent mock draft, which is from just after the Pat Kavanaugh trade back in November, currently has Denver taking attackman Jake Taylor from Notre Dame, Patrick Hackler, the short stick defensive midfielder from Hopkins, and Kevin Parnham, the defensive pole from Penn State. I don't really see it that way. Again, in my mind, your biggest need is offensive midfielder. I don't know why you would draft an attackman to try and cram into a list that already has probably 7 attackmen on it. Obviously, some of those guys are going to be playing midfield, and Jake Taylor could, potentially be a midfielder if you draft him. But it feels like we're doing too much, and so I'm not willing to go down that road. And so for me, the guy that I'd be looking at, although he has potentially shot up some of these draft boards and may not be available come the second round, although he is still currently I think projected to be that kind of early mid first round where the Outlaws are picking, and that is Matt Trainer from Penn State. He can play midfield. He is incredible. He can dodge, he can create, he can shoot, he can do pretty much everything that they would need him to do. And I think he could come in and be that guy from the midfield for them. It was pointed out after I wrote this that Josh Shawada is most likely to move up to midfield. I think he could be that guy in the midfield. So maybe you do look more towards the defensive end. Not so much, I think, for this year. Again, like we have talked about, their starting 6 is going to be lights out, but you have Will Haas, who's getting up there in age. You obviously have Jesse Bernhardt and Mike Manley, who a lot of people were somewhat surprised to see them re-sign for even this year. And obviously you're going to need to start thinking about next year, the year after, or maybe 3 years. I'd be really surprised if Mike Manley got 3 more years in him, but you need to start preparing for the future of that defense. So, again, personally, offensive midfield is, I think, your biggest need. Depending on how you feel about the rest of that roster, I personally might even go for a second offensive midfielder in the third round. But the idea of rounding out the third and fourth round with a short stick defensive midfielder and a pole, and starting to prepare for the eventuality of some of your aging stars on the back end leaving is not the worst idea. I'm just not amazing at evaluating defensive talent, especially towards the later end of the draft. I can probably give some thoughts and opinions on first rounders and maybe even some second rounders. But by the time you're looking at third and fourth round short stick defensive midfielders and poles, I'm not the guy you want talking about it. Brian is probably a pretty good, I don't know if he's still here, but Brian would be a great person to ask. But I can't really tell you who specifically to go for. But I don't think, to answer the original question, that you have to look at defense and goalie in this draft in any way. As for them making the championship, I'll put it this way. If I was the Outlaws, I would feel good about my chances this year. I don't know that I personally think they will make it, but again, if I was the Outlaws, I would feel pretty good about what I have on this roster and the likelihood for me making a run, at least a deep run, if not an actual championship era or level run. So hopefully that answers all of it. Thank you for sending that question in. I think you must have heard me say that I was going to do a mailbag and just went ahead and sent in a question. So thank you for that. The next question goes back to Dog Griff. It is the last question of the day. If you could add 2 teams to the PLL, where would you add them? And would the idea include moving the Chaos to the East? Brian is still here. He said he has to think on it. They will definitely need to replace their close D soon enough. Yes, totally agree. I'm not against the idea of finishing out your draft with short stick defensive midfielders and or defensive poles, but my thought is more about what are we going to do to win this year and maybe next year, because maybe those guys are back next year. Obviously, long term, you got to be thinking, but what can we add this year to be a championship caliber team this year? I'm not mad at anyone who thinks they should be thinking long term. It's clearly going to be important. So anyway, back to Dog Griff's question. I'll repeat it again. If you could add 2 teams to the PLL, where would you add them? And would the idea include moving the Chaos back into the Eastern Conference? This might actually be the easiest question that I have been asked. I would add Minnesota in a heartbeat. I think they deserved a team in this first round and completely understand their disappointment in not having been selected. I would, if I was them, I would feel like, what more could we do to prove to you that we needed a team in Minnesota? I think they absolutely earned it and was kind of surprised when they didn't get one. The second city would depend on whether or not Canada is in play. The PLL hasn't been back to Canada since the first season of the league in 2019. COVID was obviously the issue in 2020, but since then they have remained reluctant to go back. Most reports seem to indicate that the idea of getting the entire league of over 300 people across the border and back was proving more difficult than predicted, and they just haven't wanted to deal with that and go back. But I think as the league settles into hometowns and team owners and all that stuff, and we get into more of a home and away schedule that we're more kind of traditionally used to seeing in professional sports, I think Canada will be back on the table. It's a lot easier to get 30, 35 people of one team and, staff and all that stuff across the border and back than it is to try and get, again, like I said, 300 plus across the border and back for the entire kind of PLL under the touring model. So the obvious first choice for a Canadian team is going to be Toronto. That may be Hamilton or, whatever, but Toronto is kind of the obvious first choice. Hopefully it would not be the only Canadian team to ever be in the PLL. There are obviously lots of other Canadian towns and cities that could, support a PLL team, but Toronto is the first choice. However, if Canada is not on the table, I think the place to go is Atlanta. I know Brian's here. I know he's going to want, an upstate team or Long Islanders are going to want a Long Island team, but I'm not personally ready to start doubling up locations yet. I think we're still at a point where there are lots of places that aren't represented that could and perhaps should get a team sooner. So I'm going to take Atlanta. The league went there in 2019 and played in the former Turner Field, which is now called Center Park Stadium, and was scheduled to go back in 2020 to play in Fifth Third Bank Stadium at Kennesaw State, which was obviously canceled due to COVID, but they did make it there the following season in 2021. And while they did okay in Atlanta, I think they did better that first year in at the old Turner Field. They have not been back. However, in the years since then, the game has grown a good amount in the area, and that was kind of evidenced this past weekend when they got over 10,000 people into Bobby Dodd Stadium in downtown Atlanta for a Maryland Notre Dame game. I think if I was the league, I know Fifth Third is probably cheaper. It's a little bit smaller, so you get 10,000 in Bobby Dodd, which holds 40,000, 50,000. It might be 50. Either way, you get 10,000 in one of those stadiums. It's going to feel a lot more empty than getting, 7,000 in Fifth Third. But Fifth Third and Kennesaw State is outside of the city, and Bobby Dodd is literally right in the middle of downtown, and Turner Field is literally just outside of downtown, right there on the edge. And I think that goes a long way towards getting people to the stadium. I know, again, Turner Field has been reduced in capacity. It holds about 25. I think it is somewhere between 20 and 25. And getting 10,000 people in that stadium is a pretty good turnout. And I just think that Atlanta is a really good spot, and those two stadiums are very, very accessible to a large majority of Atlanta in a way that Kennesaw State isn't. And I know people want to see the league in brand new places, and they want to see explosive growth of the game. And as we talked about, there are going to be people that want to see hotbeds get multiple teams, and at some point they should. And I would love to see both new places and hotbeds getting multiple teams. But I honestly think that the league is better served by slow and steady growth and expansion. And I don't just mean that figuratively. I also mean it literally, looking forward towards these teams settling down into their home markets. Limiting travel distance, it can be very important in the idea of keeping this league going. I think we saw the MLL overextend itself, hit the West Coast way too early before they were prepared for it, and most of those teams did not last more than, I think, 2 seasons because it was just too tough to be flying back and forth across the country all the time. So again, I think taking that kind of incremental step to Atlanta helps grow the game, push it into a new area, and still allows the league to not overextend itself. That being said, I know that the Pacific Northwest, Texas, even another West Coast team in, Northern California. I think a lot of people don't understand how big California is, how long California is. So, if you have the Redwoods playing in San Diego and you have a NorCal team, or vice versa, you flip that, you put the Redwoods up in NorCal where it makes a little bit more sense for them, and then bring another team down to LA or San Diego or wherever you want to put them. That makes sense. I'm not against it. I'd love to see it. I'm for any growth, really, but I just feel like Atlanta might be the better option. But again, like we talked about earlier, Texas is exploding, so I'm not mad at seeing that either. So anyway, that is the last of the questions. I want to thank everyone who took the time to submit a question for me. I really appreciate that anyone listens to this, much less actually submits questions to get my opinions on. So thank you very much for submitting them. If you have other questions, please continue to submit them. I think going forward, I'm going to try and end every episode with a question from someone, and then every 6 weeks or 2 months or something, we can do a bigger kind of mailbag episode like this and answer a whole bunch of questions all at once. Again, the questions don't need to specifically be about lacrosse. I'll talk about anything. I'd love to talk about soccer or Star Wars or wrestling or, driving on I-95, whatever it is. I don't care. Literally anything. So keep submitting questions and I will keep answering them. Thank you to Brian and Chris and anyone who was watching this live. I will do some small edits and get this up for the rest of people to listen to. Thank you for putting up with my massive issues that I was having today, but that is going to be it for today. I will be back next week, hopefully, fingers crossed, with more. So until then, you can find both me and the show on social media, mostly X and Instagram, but I will catch you guys later.